Welcome to The Nation. In this week's Labor caucus meeting, the Prime Minister raised asylum seekers as one of the key issues facing the government in this election year. Border protection has become a red-hot issue once again after the increase in boat arrivals since Kevin Rudd changed his policy. Tony Abbott is, of course, capitalising on this, promising a return to tougher measures, including temporary protection visas and the Pacific solution. But just what are some of the realities around this difficult issue? Well, joining us to discuss, we have with us David Bradbury, Labor MP for Lindsay in Sydney's Outer West, an area where Labor research is showing that this is a big concern for voters in that electorate. Sydney Morning Herald journalist and author David Marr, who's written extensively on asylum seekers and Australia's border protection policies. One Nation co-founder David Oldfield, 2UE broadcaster. In fact, David was recently suspended from 2UE for comments that he made suggesting that those who tried to escape from detention centres should be, quote, fried. Comments he later apologised for and has been reinstated at 2UE. And finally, Liberal MP and Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Defence, Stuart Robert, who spent 12 years in Defence Intelligence before entering Parliament. And he is, of course, an enthusiastic supporter of Tony Abbott's plan to bring back some of these tougher border protection measures. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I want to start with the question of why people choose to flee a country in trouble. David Oldfield, why do you think, particularly Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, people are deciding to leave?
Well, look, it's understandable. Having seen pictures of the place, I can't claim to have been to Afghanistan or Sri Lanka, but given the circumstances of what life is like there, you can understand why one would leave. The question mark for Australia is that our responsibility, and how true are they in the sense of being refugees as opposed to country shoppers? And when you, of course, flee thousands and thousands and thousands of miles, as opposed to the general concept of a refugee fleeing to the closest point of safety, then you, in my mind and in many Australians' mind, stop being a refugee per se and become a country shopper.
David Marr?
Where do you start with a statement like that? Refugees are real people fleeing real persecution or the well-founded fear of persecution. The rules are tough. You don't get refugee protection in Australia unless you meet those rules. They're very tightly controlled. They're very tightly judged. People come to Australia because we, unlike any of the countries between here and Sri Lanka and here and Afghanistan, are signatories of the Geneva Conventions, which says that we will offer refugees a new life. Now, the countries you talk of just over the border don't offer new lives. They offer, at times, temporary refuge. There are millions of Afghans in Pakistan. They're also being slaughtered in Pakistan by the Taliban. Many of the latest wave of Afghans coming through to Australia at the moment are from Quetta, where gangs of Taliban are slaughtering them at random. They're accepted as refugees, or until recently, when the processing of these people was abruptly stopped as a political gesture by the government, they were accepted here after careful scrutiny by the Immigration Department as refugees.
So is it good enough then, David, for our troops to die for Afghanistan, but not for the Afghans to stay and fight themselves, but rather get on boats and come here?
That's a contemptible question.
Well, you may see it that way, but a lot of Australians wouldn't.
Well, it's the same question that might be said of, say, Jews in Europe during the 1930s and 1940s. Would you say to them, you should have stayed and fought, you shouldn't have fled? It's the same argument. It's the same argument. It's the same argument
historically to start with, because to start with, the Jews were never a fighting force, and they were also in a country occupied, of course, by an army itself, as opposed to Afghanistan, which is occupied by coalition forces, in theory protecting and bringing democracy to that country, while many of those people from that country leave. It is actually contemptible that you would relate the concept of the issue of what the Jewish people suffered under the Nazis compared to what's taking place in Afghanistan. So you are both historically and completely rationally wrong where that's concerned.
David, not at all. The refugee conventions, there are two of them, of course, were signed as an act of contrition by the world to the Jews. That's why they're there. They're there because the world closed its doors to people fleeing the Holocaust. That's why they are there. We don't ask people to stay around to be slaughtered. We don't ask people to, keep their kids in Afghanistan so that they can be tortured. We say, get out. get out and seek a safe haven. The notion that you're suggesting is contrary to the obligations that this country has not only entered into, but has sold as well as it can to the countries of this region.
Let's